This is week 8 of the Story of Israel online course. This will be the last voiceover slideshow in this course. And we'll cover the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is really just one book in the Hebrew, the books of Chronicles, and the book of Esther. Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of Judah's restoration all the way from 539 BC and the Edict of Cyrus down to roughly 430 BC. So it tells the story of the early restoration period of Judah in Canaan, and that continuing for about 100 years. One significant issue that scholars have debated is who came first. Was it Ezra or was it Nehemiah? Since both characters show up in these two books. Some have reversed the traditional order, saying Nehemiah came first, but others have suggested that no, the traditional order is correct. And that is my assumption. Ezra came first, then Nehemiah, and then both of them conducted a reform and Passover at the end of the book of Nehemiah. Another significant issue that many scholars have raised is what is the relationship between Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles? Are they part of the same history? While time does not allow us to discuss this in detail for a couple of hundred years, the majority of scholars have suggested that Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah form one coherent history. More recently, since the 70s or so, there has been some doubt about this, and my opinion is they do not belong together. One of the more important features to the book of Chronicles and the writer of Chronicles is the kingship of David and the ongoing relevance of the covenant of kingship with David and his family. Such is completely foreign to the thought of Ezra and Nehemiah, which books do not mention kingship at all. Ezra is one of two books of the Bible written in two languages, that is Hebrew and Aramaic. Daniel is the other book that's half in Aramaic and half in Hebrew. The Aramaic portions of the book of Ezra include chapters 4:8 through 6:18 and chapter 7:12 through 26. These are letters written to and from the Persian governor by Judeans, pleading their innocence. Let's talk about the history of that is referenced in the book of Ezra, Nehemiah. The picture here is an artist's representation of the full extent of the Persian Empire, one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. The book begins the same way that the book of 2 Chronicles ends, and that is with the edict of King Cyrus of Persia. After he had defeated the Babylonians, absorbed their empire, he put edicts in these cylinders all over his empire saying captive peoples should go home and rebuild their temples. That's in 539 BC. Probably in 539, or shortly thereafter, a group of Judean exiles returns home, probably very small, probably led by someone named Sheshbazzar, who was probably also of the Judean royal line of David, and who was a governor that the Persians appointed to be over the Persian province of Judea. The temple began to be rebuilt shortly after 539, but the work stopped because the people of the land, that is Arabs, Ammonites, and northerners who would later become the Samaritans, would become known as the Samaritans later in history, wrote letters to Persian authorities about the Jews saying they're rebellious, they have always been rebellious, they're guilty of sedition and treason, and they're rebuilding, and you need to put a stop to it. The Persian governor then halted the building of the temple for a period of time. After about 18 years or so, the temple and the exchange of many letters back and forth, finally the Persian governor allowed them to continue work on the temple in 520 BC, and then the temple was completed about 515 under the governorship of Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel was also a Davidic descendant, but was appointed by the Persians to be their governor in the land of Judah. Two prophets prophesied during this period of restoration and rebuilding of the temple. And those two are Haggai and the prophet Zechariah. Haggai prophesied the need to rebuild the temple before they rebuilt their own houses, because people were in Jerusalem rebuilding their houses, not rebuilding the temple, and that they weren't being blessed because of that. But if they would rebuild the temple, God would bless them. And so they did begin the process again of rebuilding in 520, and the building is finally completed in 515. The other prophet active at this time is Zechariah, and his focus was also upon the rebuilding of the temple, but also upon the restoration of the Davidic monarchy. To him, God had two anointed ones, that is, two that had been anointed messiahs, one the anointed priest, high priest, who in his case was one called Jeshua, and the other the anointed Davidic descendant, and that is Zerubbabel, that God had special plans for both of his two anointed ones. And that someday in the future, this is in chapter 6 of Zechariah, they were to lay crowns aside, because someday those crowns would be used, and God would restore his Messiah, and the anointed priest also would be at his side. And so Zechariah very much deals with, as Haggai does, with the rebuilding of the temple and the restoration of all Israel, with the eventuality in mind of total restoration of God's plans and God's prospects for the future for Israel. Ezra was a scribe, and he returned from Babylon to Judea with a group of settlers around 450 BC, give or take 10 years or so. It had been already 70 years or so since the beginning of return from exile in Babylon. Most Jews, in fact, had not returned at all from Babylon, but they had families and businesses in the area of Babylon, and so they remained. Only a trickle gradually came back across in the ensuing 100 years, but restoration of the land, rebuilding of the land, had not progressed as it should have. Even after the rebuilding of the temple in 520 to 515, work had not progressed so much on rebuilding even Jerusalem. Temple worship had not been regularized either. Ezra came with a group of exiles to return to Judah to help with the rebuilding, and he saw the situation immediately, that it was depressed and work had not progressed on the restoration of the buildings and the restoration of worship, and so he took vigorous action to ensure that happened. One of the things he did was to have Judean men put away their foreign wives in order to preserve the integrity and the identity of the Jewish people in the post-exilic era. He took several other actions related to worship as well, and brought about a major reform based upon what we can call for the first time the 5 books of Moses, that is, the Pentateuch. Nehemiah probably came somewhat later, so let's say 430 BC. He's somewhat more concerned with the political and theological restoration of Israel, less concerned with worship and purity of the people that Ezra had been more concerned with. Nehemiah was a cupbearer, that is, a close associate to the Persian king, probably a counselor of some kind. Returns to Judah between 445 and 430, and opinions vary on that. When he returned, the walls of Jerusalem were broken down. They had not been repaired. Arabs, those people who would become Samaritans, and Ammonites were threatening the Jews. Nehemiah himself led the rebuilding of the walls until they were completed. Then he brought 1/10 of the people living at that time in Jerusalem, or in Judea, into the city of Jerusalem to live there so it would be populated. He was responsible for a Sabbath reform as well, and more marriage reforms that had been begun by Ezra. Finally, Ezra joins Nehemiah for a huge Passover feast and the final restoration of all Israel in worship in the land of Judah, which is the point of the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, the restoration of all Israel in the post-exilic age. It's a picture showing Nehemiah rebuilding the walls. Let's talk about 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles deal with kingship. They begin with the death of Saul in 1st Chronicles chapter 10 and go to the final end of Judean kingship with Zedekiah and the exile of Judah, but also the Edict of Cyrus proclaiming return from exile. And so the books of Chronicles deal uniquely with Davidic kingship, from the first king David until the last king Zedekiah, after a series of genealogies in chapters 1 through 9. 50% of the book of Chronicles is word for word from Samuel and Kings, showing the chronicler's use of biblical sources. Not only does he use Samuel and Kings, he also uses many passages in the Pentateuch and also some of the prophets. The other 50% of the book of Chronicles is in the chronicler's own words and also other non-biblical sources that we don't have access to, but he seems to have many sources not available to the author of Samuel and Kings. Virtually every story also relating to the northern kingdom of Israel, the divided kingdom, has been taken out by the chronicler because it is only Judah and the south that is left of the ancient Israelite kingdom. And he wants to tell Judah's story, particularly the story of Judah's kings. So the chronicler deals almost exclusively with Judah and only occasionally with North Israel if the North Israelites show up in a story about a Judean king, such as King Jehoshaphat of Judah with King Ahab of Israel. In 1 Kings 22, that story is retained in the chronicler's history. The Judeans are the heirs of the promises and the covenant with David, and that is what the chronicler is concerned with, not at all with the history or the issues of the northern kingdom. Another issue of importance to the book of Chronicles is that all sins that David committed, with one exception, and every sin of Solomon, his idolatry, his marriage to foreign women, etc., has been removed from his history. The only sin that the chronicler allows David is the sin not of Bathsheba, that is simply taken out, but the sin of numbering the people, because that is the story of why the temple was built where it was, and that temple and its worship is extremely important to the chronicler. That is, when I say chronicler, I mean the historian, the writer of the books of Chronicles. David and Solomon, to the chronicler, are the two examples of righteous kingship. They're what kings ought to be. And so the chronicler holds these up as models of seeking God in the post-exilic age. And that, in fact, is the theme of Chronicles. Those kings who sought the Lord in worship, who sought him in prayer, who sought him at the temple, who sought the Lord by means of prophets and priests, who sought the Lord with a whole heart, were those kings who were blessed. The ones who did not, their reigns were not blessed, and in fact, they lost land and lost battles. And so that is an example or paradigm for the post-exilic age in which the chronicler lives. If we too would seek the Lord like David and Solomon did, then we too may be restored. Let's talk about the main theological features of the book of Chronicles. After chapters 1 through 9 of 1 Chronicles, which is the genealogies, and their purpose is to establish that the post-exilic Jewish community is the same people as the pre-exilic Israel, the chronicler's history begins with the death of Saul and David's rise to the throne. Chronicles ends with the demise of kingship. And so Davidic kingship, that is the covenant with David and with his descendants, and how that kingship was threatened, how it might be restored, are the primary concerns of the chronicler. Similarly, since David planned the temple in Chronicles, not so much Solomon. Solomon simply carried out the work. They are the great temple planners and builders. The priesthood and temple worship are of great concern to the chronicler alongside the issue of kingship of David and his descendants. All reforming kings in Israel's history also purified temple worship and the priesthood. A third important issue to Chronicles is retribution theology. That is, good kings are blessed with land, wealth, big families, peace. Bad kings, or kings who violated worship in some way, who were guilty of idolatry, or in some other way had sinned, lost land and wealth and battles and their lives. A fourth important issue I've already raised, and that is seeking the Lord. Chronicles begins in 1 Chronicles 10 with the death of Saul, we're told, because he did not seek the Lord. And the choice of David, because he did seek the Lord. All other kings are evaluated as to whether they sought the Lord or not. A fifth issue is that of worship and joy and praise, especially in song. Chronicles is a joyful book. It has little of the gloominess of Samuel and Kings. The book is full of examples of priests and Levites leading Judeans in worship and singing. And the chronicler in the post-exilic era is not interested in pointing out, like the earlier history had done, all of Israel's sins. The chronicler is interested in showing the post-exilic, depressed, small group of Judeans that if they turned to the Lord and sought him with their whole heart, repented of their sins and sought the Lord, that God would once again move to restore them. And if they would restore worship as well, then God would bless them. The final issue is focus on prophets. Every single king mentioned in the chronicler's history has a prophet confront them and either give them encouragement to trust in the Lord or rebuke them because of their sin. And so the prophetic word is extremely important to Chronicles. Let's talk about the book of Esther. Esther is a short historical romance. Let's call it a romance. It's a historical novella about the Jews living in the Persian Empire during the very height of Persian power, sometime between 450 BC and 350 BC, perhaps later than earlier in that period. There are really three plots that are interwoven in this book. First, there is the story of intrigue in the Persian royal harem. That is where King Ahasuerus of Persia, where his wives lived. This intrigue involved King Ahasuerus and his wife Vashti. Vashti was deposed from being queen because she refused to appear before the king and his buddies when he called to show off her great beauty to his drinking friends. That leaves them minus a queen, and so they go about the business of trying to replace her with someone more worthy, they thought. And so they did a search throughout the kingdom, found many young women. One of these was named Hadassah, who was renamed Esther. She was a Jewish young woman. She first finds favor to the eunuch in the harem, and who thinks she's absolutely wonderful. And then when she appears before King Ahasuerus, immediately he is taken by her. She becomes his favorite and eventually his queen in the place of Vashti. A third plot is the conflict between Mordecai, Esther's cousin, and Haman, the king's right-hand man. Because Mordecai refuses to bow down before Haman, who is a close counselor to the king Ahasuerus, because Mordecai obviously does not think that he is worthy of that respect, Haman plans to destroy Mordecai. But he is not certain how to carry that out. Haman discovers that Mordecai is a Jew, and he figures the easiest way to get rid of Mordecai is by implicating all the Jews living in the Persian Empire in plots against the kingdom. And so he brings to King Ahasuerus the accusation that the Jews are well-known traitors, seditious, conspirers against kingdoms and against kings, and that the king ought to kill them all. The king made an edict to that effect, that at a certain time they would be put to death. Haman and his friends determined the proper time for the destruction of the Jews by casting lots, that is, more or less six-sided dice. And so they picked out the month in which the destruction of the Jews would happen. Fortunately, it was about 11 months away. And this casting of lots, which in Persian is pur, and so Purim would be lots, the plural. This becomes then the origin story of the Jewish festival of Purim that is still observed to this day. Mordecai, also a close associate of the king. So Mordecai goes to Esther with word of this plot and asks her to intervene with King Ahasuerus because she's queen. And so perhaps succeed in stopping this plot to destroy all the Jews. Esther is initially reluctant because she said, if I go in without the king inviting me into his presence, then there is only one law, and that is the death of all those who go unbidden into the royal court without any invitation. Mordecai exhorts her to do what she can to intercede for her people, that somehow God would deliver them, but he says, who knows if you've come into the kingdom for such a time as this, to help save the Jewish people. And so Esther said, I will do it. If I perish, I perish. She goes to King Ahasuerus, and she does one thing. He extends his scepter, meaning don't kill her. I would like to see my wife, my queen. And she has only one request, and that is to invite King Ahasuerus and Haman, his counselor, to a special dinner party she's going to throw for them. When they arrive at the dinner party, Ahasuerus is not completely dim-witted, and he asks her, okay, what do you want? What is your request? And she said, I only have one request, and that is to come to another dinner party. And so they plan yet another dinner party. In the meantime, Mordecai, the king's other counselor and Esther's cousin, discovers a plot against the king by two eunuchs. The eunuchs are put to death, and the affair is enrolled in the king's daily chronicles. But the king is not really made aware of it. Sometime later, King Ahasuerus can't sleep, and so he goes and gets his royal daily chronicles to read them. Surely that will help him sleep. And so as he's reading, he runs across this account of the two officials that had been conspiring to put him to death, and that they were found out by Mordecai and themselves put to death. And he brings in his trusted advisor Haman and says, what should the king do for the one whom the king wishes to honor? Because nothing had been done for Mordecai. And Haman thought, well, he must mean me, and so he said the king should put him on a chariot and have runners run before the chariot throughout the city of Susa, announcing, thus shall be done to the one whom the king wishes to honor. Ahasuerus is pleased with this and says, fine, do so. You put Mordecai on the chariot, and you run before the chariot, saying, thus shall be done to the one whom the king wishes to honor. It's important also to mention that Haman had in fact also erected a 100-foot tall gallows upon which to hang Mordecai when the 11th month came and the time to put the Jews to death occurred. So Haman does run before Mordecai and proclaimed, thus shall be done to the one whom the king wishes to honor. When he returns, he's very upset, and his wife says, you will surely fall before this man, Mordecai. In the meantime, the next dinner has been arranged, and Ahasuerus and Haman come to the second dinner party that Esther has planned. When King Ahasuerus asked, "What is your request?" she said, "My request is for my people, because this evil Haman has made a plot to kill all of my people for no reason, and this must be stopped." Ahasuerus is very upset and leaves the room into the garden in a rage. Haman is very afraid and so bows down to the ground and grabs Esther by the feet, begging for his life. At that very moment, Ahasuerus comes back in the room and says, "What? Will you even abuse my wife in my very presence? Put this man to death." And the eunuchs there present said, "You know, he built a gallows that's 100 feet tall." And they said, "Hang him on the gallows." And so Haman is hanged on his own gallows. But the law of the Medes and the Persians required that that once it is given, it cannot be revoked. And so King Ahasuerus tells Esther and Mordecai, "I can't revoke this," but they encourage him to make a second edict, and that is all the Jews of the kingdom will be allowed to defend themselves. And so the 11th month comes, the Jews rise up, defend themselves, and kill their enemies. Well, what is the point of the book? A couple of points. One, to tell an uplifting story of courage and to show how Jews might live faithfully under foreign rule. And secondly, to show how the Feast of Purim, or the Feast of Lots, came about.